we wanted to invite a short conversation about how communities of various sorts, including Frontline and Grassroots, are thinking about novel ways to integrate a little better the economy, local economic development, and nature stuff. So to moderate this session, I would like to invite Cate Potter, the other Cate. There's just Cates everywhere around here. Cate Potter, who is the ED of the Canadian National Biosphere Reserve Association. Off we go. Thank you.
Thank you. We are missing one of our speakers. Oh, there he is. All right, lovely. Hi, everyone. So I was telling somebody at lunch that I was hosting or moderating this session, and they told me, oh, well, you're between us and happy hour, or us and outside. So we are going to keep this short and snappy and exciting for the end of the day. We also have a very aggressive timer, very large, and apparently it turns red when we get to the end, so we will be on our best behavior. So I'd like to introduce the panelists for this session. We have Isabel Simons, Research and Engagement Coordinator with the IISAAK OLAM Foundation, Cate Mingoya, Chief Officer of Climate Resilience and Land Use from Groundwork USA, and Mauricio Miramontes, co-founder of Mano del Mono, and then me. Okay, so we had a chance to chat last week, kind of prepping for this session. We've got some questions. We'll look at the audience questions if we have a moment. But first, we're going to start with why the four of us are actually up here. So I work for a national association called the Canadian Biosphere Regions Association. It supports and promotes the work of the 19 UNESCO designated biosphere reserves in Canada, also known as biosphere regions. There's also 28 in the US, around 40 in Mexico, and 700 worldwide. And the biosphere regions really are community development organizations working at the intersection of conservation, culture, and economic development. So that's why I'm here. Isabel, maybe a quick introduction of what brings you to the stage?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel Simons. I'm with IISAAK OLAM Foundation. We're an educational nonprofit based on Vancouver Island. I'm grateful to be here on Musqueam territories today. If there's anyone from that nation here, Haitchka Sayam. Yeah, I'm a third-generation Canadian. My ancestors came here about 100 years ago from Venezuela, from Spain, and from Scotland, and on my father's side from the Ukraine. And a lot of my work with IISAAK OLAM Foundation focuses in on the economic dimensions of IPCAs, so economics, infrastructure, and financing, and I'll share a bit more about that shortly.
Hello? Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Salazar for the invitation. My name's Cate. I'm the Chief Officer of Climate Resilience and Land Use at Groundwork USA. I'm a former middle school teacher. I am a trained land use planner and community organizer. And Groundwork is the national support organization for a network of 21 people-centered environmental organizations across the country. We're usually in kind of the second or third largest city in a state, places that have a history of industry. The industry comes, they trash the land, they trash the economy, they peace out. Groundwork comes in and works closely with residents to put them in the driver's seat in making changes to their built environment. And that's everything from acting as the urban forester to densify the tree canopy cover, reduce heat, capture flood water, to transforming parcels of contaminated land into usually non-revenue generating community assets. Think like parks, trails, urban farms, stuff like that. We do youth programming to get young people from these communities into family wage supporting jobs, not just a quick in and you're out apprenticeship program, but being able to get their fingernails dirty, making changes to their community, and then leaving with the ability to get jobs. And then finally, systems change is a big part of our work. We know that our communities don't look the way they do by accident. There's a reason. They're not going to change by accident. We've got to not just fix the harm that's happened, but also change the system so that that harm doesn't happen again. And we do that through hyper-local community organizing. So happy to be here.
Hi, nice to meet you. We haven't seen each other. And well, my name is Mauricio Miramontes. I live in Chiapas in South Mexico, in San Cristobal de las Casas. I usually say that I wash my clothes there, and then we are traveling around Mexico in different protected areas. So, and the work we do, we work in La Mano del Mono, and we do sustainable tourism in protected areas in partnership with rural and indigenous communities, mainly with market-based strategies to create complementary and sustainable economies in these companies. We do mainly two things. One program is called Market Ready Model, and that's a platform that connects local communities, most of them are rural and indigenous run, with travel trade partners, so that they can, increasing this market readiness of the companies and facilitating this connection with partners. At the same time that there is this process to connect the touristic product to direct impact in whatever sustainable livelihood that is. So here, just sharing some pictures of how Mexico looks like, and maybe you want to come soon. It's a wonderful Datsiancan. Those are the Eje Neovolcánico, the high mountains of Mexico. And then that's the coast of Oaxaca, also beautiful, beautiful place. A lot of huge mangroves. That's also Eje Neovolcánico. And then that's Chihuahua, this Copper Canyon with the Rarámuris communities. And there's the Biosphere Reserve El Triunfo. So I will say, like, all of them, all these communities, they do have a sustainable production of, can be coffee, cacao, fisheries, different activities, but most of them also, they face important threats connected to climate change or connected to market periods of selling, plagues. So tourism is a complement in their economies. And the other thing that we do, recognizing that gap and that huge opportunity that tourism represents as an economy, it's called Reserva Natura, and that's a digital booking system for protected areas, managed by communities, by public sector or by private sector. So you can, as you book one room with 2 beds and you cannot come with 10 people, with your whole family, well, the same concept, but for the monarch butterflies. So what is the carrying capacity for that? So how can we upload those information so that the visitor can book, they can pay. Unfortunately, we still have also a huge gap, like 85% of the visitors to natural areas are not able to contribute economically for the management and conservation of those lands because there is not a system in place. So we facilitated that technology for rural communities. And yes, so we have a lot of fun. We visit mountains, beaches, whales, quetzales, and yes, it's a fun work, and we love what we do, and we're really happy to be in this panel. Thank you for the invitation.
Wonderful, thank you. Cate, Cate with a C, I'm Cate with a K. That was very confusing on the prep call. Cate, I wonder if maybe you can build on what Mauricio was saying with some of the examples and give an example of a conservation economy through your work.
Yeah, I think that in urban spaces where land is extremely limited, you are faced with kind of a tough and uncomfortable question, which is land conservation the way we traditionally think about it, which is we're going to set aside this land. Is this the highest and best use in a place that has incredible housing insecurity, that has health concerns, that has lack of recreation access, that has flooding and extreme heat concerns? And I think ideally when transforming land into something that is more useful for folks in it. We're looking to pet a lot of cats with one hand. So if any of you guys have been to New Orleans before, I think there's a great example there. In the Treme neighborhood, there is used to be, about 100 years ago, this beautiful linear park that stretched through this upper-class Black neighborhood. There were these soaring 100-year live oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, and the upper-class Black community would recreate there. The stormwater would be captured, the heat would be brought down, and a thriving economic and social community was there. And then the 60s happened, and like in parts of the United States and in Eastern Canada, the Highway Administration just bulldozed the entire neighborhood, and you can now visit the Claiborne Avenue Expressway there. That creates a lot of problems. The homes around there flood. It's really hard to get to work because it's blaringly, beatingly hot in New Orleans, and a lot of folks don't have access to public or private transportation. And you're more likely to find a burnt-out couch than you are a park bench. But one of the projects that our affiliate Groundwork New Orleans took on was to create vision to reality of park. It's about the size of 1/5 of this room. But it's a bioswale that helps to capture about 80,000 gallons of stormwater per rain event. It reduces the land surface temperature by about 36 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius on a given summer day. And it also provides job opportunities to folks who are from Treme, who worked with local indigenous New Orleanians to choose native plants to populate the bioswale. I went there twice, once at the beginning and once at the end of the project. And the first time, it was an old dusty lot with burnt out mattresses. And the second time I got to see an egret hunting for snakes in the bioswale. So if you think not just about the ecological benefits, there's also the benefit of having a green space in your neighborhood underneath what is an expressway that puts off really choking levels of pollution, having people invest in their communities and get paid a family-sustaining wage. So these types of conservation projects can pet a couple cats with one hand. Last thing that I'll say is that these small urban projects, these parks that are 1/5 the size of this room, we can't compete with the Amazon in terms of carbon capture or even in terms of biodiversity, but we can engage in what I like to call patchwork conservation, where we can pull together a network of green spaces, parks, trails, and areas that are helpful not just to the non-human animals that exist in these spaces, but also to human animals. We like to think that we're above or beyond habitats, but we need a decent habitat too.
Thanks, Kate. An example from the Biosphere Region Network is from Bredberry Lake, which is in Saskatchewan. So right now they're kind of building not a complete conservation economy system, but a contribution to that. So they have built a greenhouse where they're sourcing and growing native plants for restoration happening in the area. They have a research hub or a research lodging facility for academics coming into the area because it's in a very rural and remote area. They're doing an interpretive center, bird banding, glamping domes, all within kind of a few properties that the Biosphere region own to employ local people, bring people to the area, but doing so in a sustainable way. So I think we'll move over to Isabel now. Can you give us a bit of perspective from your work with an Indigenous lens on what kind of conservation economies might look like in Indigenous communities?
Yes, but first, I kind of botched my introduction. I didn't share very much about what IISAAK OLAM is or what we do, so with permission, I'll go back and share a little bit more context, more of a sweeping introduction. So IISAAK OLAM Foundation, neither of those words may be familiar to many of you, but we're a cross-cultural organization, and we bridge two concepts that are both from different cultures. IISAAK is the highest law of the Nuu-chah-nulth Constitution. It translates directly to respect, but more specifically to observe, appreciate, and act accordingly. And then olam is from the Hebrew phrase tikkun olam, and olam means to heal or repair the world, and it speaks to a sacred moral duty that all Jews and all people have to leave the world better than they found it. And the reason that we brought those two together dives into the cultures of our co-founders, Eli Enns and Monica Shore, a Nuu-chah-nulth man and a Jewish woman. And it kind of speaks to the way we operate. So our work is cross-cultural, and our aim is really to bridge communities and peoples that are coming from different worldviews and do that in a good way. Our North Star is biocultural diversity, so kind of tying it back into what Dallas from Nanwakolis Council is speaking to this morning. We work at the intersection of nature and language and culture. So recognizing that in the repositories of place-based people's knowledge systems, Indigenous languages and Indigenous cultures hold a lot of information about the relationships to place, how ecosystems function and work, and their responsibilities going forward. And economic practices are interwoven in that. So we work in the conservation space, recognizing that within Canada's biodiversity targets and the implementation of the 30 by 30 mandate, there are a lot of opportunities for meaningful reconciliation, for land back, and really to create transformative change. And a lot of the locus around that is through conservation economies. So that's an area of interest. Our work is rooted in a report that was released in 2018 by the Indigenous Circle of Experts, some of whom are in the room. Hey. So that was released in 2018, and it spoke to some pathways forward. The subtitle of the report was Achieving Pathway to Canada Target 1. For folks in the international space, that's IISAAK Target 11. Through Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and in the spirit and practice of reconciliation. So our work supports Indigenous nations who are establishing and managing IPCAs, or Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Many in the room will be familiar with that framework, but I'll speak a bit more to it for those who aren't. IPCAs is essentially a catch-all term for Indigenous-led conservation areas that are being established by Indigenous governments, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments through their legal orders. IPCAs are not conventional parks. They actually intervene in the park system as we have known it historically. So in Canada, the park system was used as an instrument of dispossession, right? And because of that, not only is there a legacy of suffering and a legacy of displacement that's been associated with parks and protected areas, but they also have not been effective in preserving biodiversity. They've been tailored more towards recreation and user experience. So what IPCAs, again, a catch-all term, some nations will use different words. So for example, in Tloquet territories where I live, they're tribal parks. Just north of there in Moachet-Muchelet territories, they're salmon parks. But they are Indigenous-led and governed, and they operate through Indigenous worldviews, so in a way that's more holistic and in a way that is not conservation or fortress conservation as we understand it. So really working through planning and land use that is integrated. Within that, there's going to be economic activities, there's going to be community development opportunities. And I think that covers most of the background here. And your question was to speak to economic development opportunities within IPCAs or with an IPCA lens. Of course, okay, I'm not an Indigenous person, so I cannot provide an Indigenous lens on that. But when you're looking through that framework of IPCAs, again, a model of conservation that's holistic, that's integrated, that brings in different kinds of activities that contribute to the long-term subsistence of that area. There's been a lot of real creativity in the types of projects. There's kind of three interconnected dimensions of IPCA economic development. So on the high end, there's like harnessing the larger financial flows, so doing work like the folks at Coast Funds, at Coastal First Nations and Nunwukolis are doing, harnessing blended finance and driving large amounts of money into investment ecosystems at the regional scale. And then we have the kind of community investment scale, so when you get to more localized and regional examples, a lot of that is in the transition and in achieving just transitions. So just a small example of this, Quaker First Nation on the Central Coast recently reclaimed a fish farm, so a stranded asset from extractive industry, and has converted that into a research outpost. So there's a lot that can be done there. There's infrastructure is a huge aspect of it, community planning, localized investment ecosystems, so just thinking through economic diversification at the community level, especially here on the coast where we're dealing with the legacy of extractive industry, as in everywhere else, but with forestry, with aquaculture, and mining, for example. So thinking through the reclamation of that and diversifying industry in ways that are healthier for the land and also going to keep more revenues within the community. And then it's also really important, I'm channeling my colleague Terry, to bring up traditional economies and the revitalization of indigenous foodways and tradeways and land-based subsistence as like a core element of that. So all of those things kind of work together, and within an IPCA lens, you really want to be paying attention to all of them at scale. Is that helpful?
I feel like we could have had a whole session just on that one response right there. But instead, looking at the time, we're going to move on to Cate. Cate, I wonder if you could give us a perspective on what good decision-making looks like and why it's important in kind of this conversation we're talking about.
I'm a big believer that land is a vessel for our values, how we choose to engage with it, what we build or don't build, who we talk to about it or don't talk about it, says a lot about the way that we view the world and one another. And one of the core values of the Groundwork Network is shared leadership and decision-making. And I think that you can't have really good decisions that are wise, stable, and lasting unless at that grassroots level, you're engaging in authentic shared leadership. And I think part of that means ceding some degree of power, rethinking who the experts are. I think a lot of the times we look towards the hydrologists and the PhD folks and the trained planners, all who have something to bring, but sometimes ignore the expertise of the folks who are living in community. No one knows your neighborhood better than you do. You know where that like janky piece of concrete is that you don't want to trip over. You know whose shingles are awry on their house. You know where it's really hot to walk in the summertime. So your expertise as a community scientist in a way is incredibly valuable. One of the things that we engage in is in our shared leadership is taking a data-informed approach. I use that intentionally. I don't like to say data-driven because I feel like we've had some bad outcomes from that, but I think that there's a lot for us to learn by gathering information from our communities. We work with our intergenerational coalitions to do a lot of community science data gathering. So everything from marking down where the dead trees are in a neighborhood to using FLIR or FLIR cameras to get a sense of land surface temperature or sensors for ambient air temperature, and then use that to pair with people's lived experience to come up with wiser, more stable solutions. An example of that is, this is maybe 7 years ago, we were doing work in Richmond, Virginia, and there was this crosswalk that kept flooding. And when I say flooding, I mean imagine carrying like your kid and your groceries and you're wading through water that's up to your shins to get across the street to the city's only bus stop, which is where where that neighborhood's bus stop and where the school bus stopped. And when you look at this, you think, oh, well, of course, there's a technology solution to this. Just put a cistern in the ground. But when we spoke to residents, they said, no, we actually want a lot of trees in this neighborhood. The trees are going to absorb the stormwater. The trees are going to provide some visual diversity, which is going to keep people from speeding. It's a traffic calming strategy. And if you've ever had to wait at a bus stop in Virginia, you know that it is real hot in the summer. And so people wanted that shade, something the city wasn't able to provide. So through that shared leadership with residents, we came up with a much wiser solution, and we're able to chart a path forward from that. I'd say finally, the last piece that's important about shared leadership and decision making is making sure that you close the loop once that intervention has taken place. People are letting you into their communities. People are choosing to work with you. And any data that you collect, any information that you get, it's really vital that you share it with them so that they can utilize that tool for whatever they need to use it for.
Thanks, Cate. Mauricio, we're coming to you first with this next question. If we could spend a couple of minutes each talking about the pressures, barriers, or external forces kind of outside of your control that are affecting some of the conservation economy work that you're working on.
Yes.
And only a couple of minutes because we had a really deep conversation. Like we've talked, there have been themes popping up, some colorful names mentioned throughout the course of the day. Like we could spend, lots and lots of time on this kind of theme, but we'll just touch on it a little bit from the different country perspectives.
Yes, I remember once we were facilitating the national meeting of learning community in protected areas conservation, and there was one girl like crying, super frustrated, like, I have such a sustainable fishery in the coast of Chiapas, but I cannot sell, the restaurants are not buying. I'm struggling because we have been for 5 years working in this and we don't get it. They don't buy it, but it's super sustainable fishery. And then there was another guy from Oaxaca saying, what's your favorite dessert? And the girl like, lemon pie? Yes. If you want to go and fish a snook, am I saying right, snook? I don't know if that's a snook. No, yes? A snook, yes. If you want to go and fish a snook, what do you use? Well, I get the live shrimp. Of course, it looks very obvious, right? You don't put lemon pie to fish a snook. That's a problem with conservationists. You believe that everyone likes lemon pies. And that's your problem, guys. And no, if you're gonna go and fish snooks, even though I understand that you love lemon pie, the snook does not like and does not eat lemon pies. You need a shrimp because that's what they like. So I guess that's one of the biggest barriers. The way we talk, the way we say our narrative, it's sometimes very different when we want to get and talk to private sector. We don't speak this market language. When we are in the Latin American Forum of Impact Investment, we see all these environmentalists and conservationists, including me, of course. And it's like, yes, but you know, the planet and the 2030 by what? And it's something, it's another language. It's our lemon pie, and we love lemon pies. But these guys don't know what is a lemon pie. They want to see shrimps. So I guess connecting that and being able to get the shrimp, to put it in the hook, and use shrimps, even though we love lemon pies. So I guess that's one of the main barriers, our language. We need to, if you want to come to Mexico, it's like, you really want to know to say, hey, una tortilla más, por favor, la salsa verde para mi taquito. You know, like that's something that you need to be in Mexico. So I guess we also need to learn this market language and this financial language. And well, specifically for Mexico, in many, unfortunately, in the last years, we also have another big emergent economy that is connected with organized crime. So that is there. It's there in fisheries, it's there in forestries, it's there in tourism, it's there in many other, not only drugs, not only trafficking people, it's like it's getting into other value chains. So that's also very tough because, for example, in tourism, a guide in one day will get, I don't know, like $100. And with doing the same work, but with the organized crime, they get 1,000. So it's like, how do you compete with that economy? So I guess those are the two main barriers. Learning to leave our lemon pie aside and get to use streams to talk to private sector, and also, yes, this situation in Mexico that is growing.
Sure. So we are, at Groundwork is one of the many organizations that has had a number of our federal grants cut. I see you out there. I know you also did. And I think that it's a huge challenge because there is this thought that, I think this ambient thought in the back of a lot of people's minds in the United States that like, well, eventually the government's gonna get to it. If it's important enough, they're gonna fund it, they're gonna pass a law, someone's gonna take care of it. But I think that the work that is going to stabilize our communities, that's going to bring sustainable economic development, that's going to preserve green spaces is gonna have to happen on the hyper-local level. And I'm talking about like the city councilor district up to that city and municipal level. And in order to do that, as a culture, we're going to need to, one, have an active imagination. I think people from the United States were really great at ingenuity. We sometimes can lack imagination about what's possible in the future, how broadly we can push the boundaries of things like capitalism and white supremacy, how we can potentially turn on its head the way that we view the conservation of spaces. When Theodore Roosevelt, former president, was championing the National Park Service, he was very explicit that he wanted these lands to be conserved for the recreation and regeneration of upper-class white men. And that's something that we haven't entirely shaken in the reputation of conservation, and it's something that we haven't entirely shaken in terms of our relationship to the land, moving from a dominating perspective to more of a conservation stewardship, symbiosis relationship with that land. So while it's really devastating and extremely disappointing that a lot of the dollars are disappearing at the federal level, I think there's a really fantastic opportunity that's going to come out of it to get people who are in the nonprofit sector, at the municipal sector, to come together in deeper partnership to troubleshoot around these challenges. There have been really wonderful networks of nonprofits that have existed for a long time, but I think there's an opportunity now to create almost this kind of mega network where we get to know one another, stop fighting for resources, and instead look to see where we can pet a couple cats with one hand.
Thanks. I mean, I think the one thing that we see very often is that there is this real like inflexibility and kind of a challenge within some of the settler colonial institutions that are not able to adapt and change and open up space for some of the economic creativity and experimentation that needs to happen to really be able to happen. So one example of this would be like working within the context of forest development and like the BC Ministry of Forests. Like there are just structural issues that are baked into those institutions, and that is who nations are negotiating with when they're trying to influence forest policy. And I think that there's a real challenge to steer that ship in another direction when its very structure as it was created was meant to do one thing. So it's a worldview thing to a certain degree. Like the concept that we work through is Nuchalnuth, it's Hishukisawak. It means that everything is one and everything is interconnected. And when we go into, you know, my boss Eli would invoke etymology here and speak to the root word of economics, meaning oikonomia. And what that really means is the wise and prudent management of the house. And I think that the concept of economics as it's baked into a lot of our institutions on the Crown side, on the Canadian side, is really more crematistic. So it's around the study of the accumulation of money, the amassing of wealth, right? Rather than considering the different aspects of the economy as being embedded in the ecology and being inseparable from that. So it's just very challenging to create space for new systems to take root when you're coming up against very like, you know, bulky and dated institutions that are trying to change, but it's or maybe they're not, but I think that they are, and it's challenging. So it takes a lot of time, and the question is, do we have this time, right? Because industrial development is ongoing. So as these areas are being declared, negotiations are underway, I think that we're still continuing to lose the old growth that we have left. There's, you know, the status quo is really ingrained and embedded, and it's difficult to effect change when you're working in that context. And then I guess on the other end of it, like on the policy front, like one of our programs that I work on with Stephen, who was on stage today, is supporting nations that are interested in exploring nature-based solutions markets, so carbon market pathways. And the issue of jurisdiction, I think that he mentioned this earlier, is a really challenging one, because to be able to meet market standards, you need to be able to prove a certain degree of permanence over the ability of a nation, for example, to make decisions about that area of land over a certain period of time. And the question of jurisdiction in Canada is one that has a lot of nuance, and I think that international markets and carbon markets aren't really equipped to see that, and we don't have a lot of tools to be able to launch these projects without, you know, potentially going into the adversarial system in the courts, going into really lengthy negotiations, court cases. So we don't have tools to fast track the kind of innovation that's needed within that context. So I think there are a lot of like impediments and structural barriers to getting work off the ground, unless you're very well resourced or you've been laying groundwork for a long time, but there is a pressure of time.
So I'd say yes to everything Isabel just said, because that was very elegant. And I would also add, from a Biosphere region perspective, I would say the need for mainstreaming, the need for biodiversity conservation within public. Someone mentioned it earlier about getting it onto the radar of elected officials and getting them to recognize the need for it. having some kind of creative innovation type space to build new models, just to mention a few. But I think this kind of it leads into one of the questions from the audience. Just a small question. Do we need to dismantle capitalism in order for communities and natures to succeed? I'm not sure we're going to answer that one in Folsom today, but I would like to, we've got a few minutes left. We'll leave some time for the end question. But there's a question, do the current federal politics make your grassroots community-led work more difficult? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I think it makes the grassroots work more important. If there's something that's giving me some degree of hope, it's how effectively communities are coming together to develop mutual aid societies and to fill the gaps in federal and local government and to set priorities at the community level. And I think that's how it's wise, lasting, and stable. In the work that we do, we know that there's not enough money, as in most cities, to do things like water a tree for 2 years so that it's fully established. But what you do have is a lot of people power. So how do you train folks to be able to take on that role of caring for trees in the linear park that's around the corner from their house? And so I think that grassroots organizing is something that we need to turn our attention to as the primary mechanism for change between now and whenever we decide to either dismantle capitalism or remember that it's only been around in its current form for 225 years.
Anyone else? Mauricio?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, having federal budget, it always fulfill a piece of the puzzle. So it's, yes, I guess there is an impact. That's something that we are expecting during the years, and now, well, in Mexico, we also in the last years we have had also a huge reduction of budget for the environmental sector. It has dropped like 70% in the last decade. So it's a lot. And yes, of course, that has a huge impact. Nevertheless, at the same time, I guess that's the creativity in terms of systems. It's coming and it's emerging, and there are like a lot of efforts on market-based strategies. There are a lot of organizations funding these grassroots efforts. So I guess that's creating a new also network on how we're going to deal with this situation. Understanding that might not change in the next years, so at least in the next few years. So I guess that's also a huge opportunity to reimagine the paradigm where we are standing at this moment, and also learning to use the force of the market. I guess there is a huge force there. It has also its challenges. But I guess that's a huge opportunity for us, the NGOs, to connect with these market forces and market economies.
Well, I'll add that, especially during the election period when we weren't really sure which federal party was going to get in, one of the complaints that we've had in the past about biosphere regions from biosphere region organizations is how to simply explain the work of the biosphere region. And I think in this particular time, it actually served to our advantage because we cover such a breadth of work that we are able to kind of align ourselves with different policies of different platforms. And I think, I think everybody would probably say that the federal policies and priorities are never going to be enough for what we want, but we can find areas of alignment to move forward certain aspects of our work. Okay, a quick question for Mauricio, and then we'll wrap up. Is there a process for certifying ecotourism as truly sustainable, similar to the way that we do that for fisheries? And how can I, as a tourist, be sure that my tourist dollars are benefiting local communities?
Yes, that's a interesting question because, like, for example, in Mexico, 85% of the companies are not market ready. So there are not the capabilities and tools to connect and access to these markets. So then, therefore, the profitability of those companies is usually vulnerable. So certifications are usually you need the budget to certify. So that sustaining the certification is hard. We have a national certification, which tend to be the more accessible certification. But from those, we were able, from the 3,000 companies, we were able to certify about 50. And from those 50, 90% dependent of federal budget. So, you know, like it's hard at this in the sector to sustain that when most of these companies do not have the budget to reinvest on that. So so having said this, there is I will recommend you to connect if you want to come to Mexico. There is this company called Rutopia. And they are doing very, very nice work connecting with local communities and a very fair trade with them and working with the products. So Rutopia will be a nice tour operator to connect in Mexico. Nevertheless, they are not certified by the Sustainable Ecotourism Association, but that's one of the challenges. And just going the Adventure Travel Trade Association, which is this international association for adventure tourism, is promoting sustainable practices as a badge, but not a certification, because again, having an auditor coming to your place, checking that checklist, it's not easy to do it in most of these rural and indigenous-based companies.
Before we move on to our last question, I'll just add that if you are looking for an area to travel to, the Biosphere regions are quite lovely. There's 19 across the country, but in kind of the certification vein, these areas have to report back to UNESCO every 10 years to showcase that they are upholding the standards set by UNESCO in the global program. So there is that kind of standardization of criteria, but I know I find as a tourist it's really hard. There's so many certifications, you know, is it greenwashing? Is it actually valid? Is it going back to the community? So as a conservation professional, I find it difficult. I can't imagine how the public who is trying to dip their toe or is concerned and want to know how to do more, how to kind of navigate that. Okay, so the timer says we are wrapping up. So our last question is to ask everyone, what does the future of conservation economies look like to you? Let's start with Isabel.
Sure. I think that it's really important to center economic justice in the transition and really think hard about what that means. One concept that I would invoke that I've been exposed to in the last couple years is social permaculture. So if folks are familiar with permaculture and the principles which really were lifted from, again, indigenous communities in the 70s and really widely implemented in the 70s, 80s, 90s, what they were finding was that folks could come together with a lot of technical knowledge about how to build a garden and how to implement the zones, but the communities that they were forming around those zones were becoming oppressive and becoming unjust and reproducing patriarchy, reproducing colonialism, reproducing the oppressive social relations that you'd see in the wider society. So in response to that, the concept of social permaculture was coined. And that basically is the impetus for people to do the inner work, do the relational work, do the decolonizing work, do the grief work that's needed for them to be able to show up in relationship and show up in community in a really good way. And I think that like with the economy, it's exactly the same. So I think there's both an individual impetus to like really look inwards for, as particularly for settlers, for non-Indigenous, for non-BIPOC folks to like think about if you're gonna be in those spaces, how can you show up to that in a way that's gonna be generative and isn't gonna reproduce the same dynamics that have caused the economy as we know it to be so harmful, and then build from there. And I think that like with that as a footing, there's a lot of opportunity for like real creativity, real transformation, like at the individual level, at the local community and grassroots level, and then kind of ratcheting up into systems. Yeah, I think that the IPCA framework and IPCA innovation itself creates like a really welcoming space for people to come to that. So I guess it's just an invitation to consider the spirit and intent of the early treaties, the relationship that we all have as treaty people among communities, and like, what are you bringing to the transformation? Because we can't do it technically, it needs to be a social process. So I don't know if that answers clearly, but that's my musing.
That's wonderful. Kate?
I'd say a sense of people-centeredness and to not lose sight of the fact that we are human animals who have the ability to live in greater harmony with one another and with our green and conserved spaces, and that if we're going to make any sort of wise, stable, and lasting progress on these issues of biodiversity, of adapting to the climate crisis, of reducing our climate emissions, all of the things that kind of plague us and bring us into this room, that the tent needs to be a lot wider, and we need to consider all of the different types of people and perspectives who've historically been left out of these conversations, because there's a great amount of wisdom in seeking people who have non-traditional expertise, expertise that is not, again, followed by those letters from the degree that you got, but people who, through indigenous knowledge or lived experience, or a new type of curiosity, can bring solutions that are a lot wiser and a lot more stable than you'd get otherwise.
Mauricio?
Well, for me, I imagine a delicious, huge ceviche of shrimps, and then, as a dessert, a pie lemon to share. I mean, getting economy, like social enterprises. So from grassroots, there is a huge movement. I remember 2013, it was the first time I heard in Brazil social enterprise, and I was 100% sure that didn't exist in Mexico. So I came back to Mexico, I was like, what is that? And now it's a whole ecosystem of companies with business model and impact model, and they are growing like that. And they're still small, it's still immature, the sector, but that's growing a lot. So I can imagine how that's gonna look in 10 years. At the same time, education for big corporates, like these big companies that are also having a huge impact, and they know that they are, the business model is vulnerable to, but we need to learn how to use the streams. We need to learn to connect with the financial language, with the market language. So that's going to be a switch. We are seeing that switch. And so, yes, that's what I imagine, ceviche and lemon pie.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to end the session by saying my vision for the future would be to leverage the success, whether it's in the Biosphere regions outwards, or taking, as someone mentioned, the Okanagan and Kootenai examples, leverage success from what we've been able to do, from others, and we don't all have to start at ground zero all the time, so leverage that success into other areas. And with that, I think we're just closing notes, and then we're done for the day. So thanks, everyone.